There's a moment, fleeting, electric, when desire stops being about another person and becomes a question about yourself. You feel it in your chest first, that pull, that ache that modern culture calls lust and tries to sell back to you in 1,000 hollow packages. But what if I told you that Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in depth psychology, believed that what we call sexual desire is actually the soul's hunger for wholeness, and that most of us are starving ourselves by mistaking the shadow for the substance? Picture this. It's 2 a.m., and you're alone with that familiar restlessness, that craving that no amount of scrolling, shopping, or surface connection seems to satisfy. Your body is speaking a language your mind has forgotten how to interpret. Society whispers that you're either repressed or indulgent, frigid or wild, but never simply human. Never someone standing at the threshold of something sacred that's been buried under centuries of shame, commodification, and misunderstanding. Jung called it the conjunctio, the mystical union, and he didn't mean the cheap thrill our culture has reduced sexuality to. He meant the alchemical marriage of opposites within yourself, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and flesh. He understood something that our pornography-saturated, intimacy-starved age has completely forgotten: that sexual energy is psychic energy, and how you relate to it determines whether you become whole or remain forever fragmented, chasing ghosts in other people's bodies. I spent years caught in that cycle myself. The late-night searches, the relationships that felt intense but left me emptier, the gnawing sense that desire was something to manage, suppress, or indulge, but never actually understand. Until I discovered Jung's perspective, and everything shifted. Not because he offered some puritanical roadmap or libertine permission slip, but because he revealed desire as a sacred messenger, a psychic force that, when properly understood, becomes the very engine of spiritual transformation. This isn't about morality. This isn't about rules. This is about power, your power, and how the misunderstanding of sexual energy keeps you small, scattered, and searching for completion in all the wrong places. Jung knew that the transcendence of lust doesn't mean its elimination. It means its integration, its elevation, its transformation from compulsive craving into conscious creative force. So, if you've ever felt that there must be something more, something deeper than the endless cycle of arousal and emptiness, connection and abandonment, highs that fade into self-recrimination, you're already halfway there. You're already hearing the call that Jung spent his lifetime trying to articulate, that your sexuality isn't a problem to solve but a mystery to enter, a force to befriend, a path to becoming truly, finally, powerfully yourself. Carl Jung didn't write self-help books about sex. He wrote about the human psyche as if it were a cosmos, vast, layered, containing both heaven and hell, and always seeking balance. And at the center of that cosmos, pulsing like a star, was Eros, not the cute cherub of Valentine's Day, but the ancient Greek principle of connection, desire, and the drive toward union. For Jung, sexual energy wasn't just biological. It was libido in the deepest sense, psychic life force, the same energy that fuels creativity, ambition, spiritual longing, and the urge to become more than you currently are. When a person feels sexual desire, Jung argued, they're experiencing the psyche's fundamental impulse toward wholeness, toward transcending the isolation of the ego and merging with something greater. But here's where it gets interesting, and where Jung parts ways with both religious repression and modern permissiveness. He believed that when sexual energy remains purely literal, when it's only expressed through physical acts divorced from psychological awareness, it becomes compulsive, empty, even destructive. The person mistakes the symbol for the reality. They're trying to fill an inner void through outer contact, and it never works. The hunger returns, sharper each time. Jung observed this pattern in his patients again and again. Successful men engaging in serial affairs, never satisfied. Women trapped in relationships that were intensely sexual but emotionally barren, wondering why they felt so alone. People using sex like a drug for escape, validation, power, or the temporary illusion of intimacy, and waking up more fragmented than before. He called this concretization, the reduction of a spiritual symbol to a literal act. It's the difference between eating a meal and eating a photograph of a meal, between drinking water and drinking the word water. The form is there, but the nourishing essence is missing. Jung's alternative was radical for his time and remains radical now. He suggested that sexual energy, when consciously engaged, could be transformed into spiritual and creative power. Not through repression. Jung warned repeatedly against the dangers of repression, which only drives desire into the shadow where it becomes twisted and compulsive, but through integration. This is where Jung's concept of the inner marriage comes in. He noticed that men carry an unconscious feminine side, the Anima, and women carry an unconscious masculine side, the Animus. Most people, he observed, project these inner figures onto external partners, falling in love not with actual humans, but with their own unconscious opposites reflected back to them. That's why new love feels so magical, and why it so often curdles into disappointment. You're not actually meeting another person, you're meeting yourself in disguise. The spiritual art, Jung argued, is learning to recognize this projection, to withdraw it, and to cultivate the inner union between your conscious personality and your unconscious opposite. When a woman integrates her inner masculine, her capacity for assertion, logic, independence, creative power, she becomes whole. When a man integrates his inner feminine, his capacity for feeling, receptivity, intuition, emotional depth, he becomes whole. And here's the transformation: when you become whole within yourself, your external relationships change completely. You no longer need others to complete you. You no longer use sex as a band-aid for inner emptiness. You can engage with desire consciously, choosing connection from wholeness rather than craving it from lack. This is what Jung meant by transcending lust, not killing it, not denying it, but elevating it, transforming raw appetite into conscious relationship, compulsive need into creative force, scattered energy into focused power. The path isn't easy. It requires you to face uncomfortable truths about yourself, to sit with desire without immediately acting on it, to ask what your attractions are really telling you about your unlived life. It requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension without collapsing into one pole or the other, until something new emerges. But the reward is immense. You reclaim your energy. You stop hemorrhaging power through compulsive patterns. You become the alchemist of your own experience, turning the lead of blind craving into the gold of conscious creativity. You discover that the fire you thought would consume, you can actually illuminate your path forward, if you learn to tend it with awareness rather than fear it or feed it mindlessly. Jung had a term that explains more about human sexuality than most modern sex research: the shadow. It's everything about yourself that you refuse to acknowledge, the desires you're ashamed of, the fantasies you'd never admit, the hungers that contradict your self-image, the parts of yourself you've exiled to the basement of consciousness because they don't fit who you think you should be. And here's the brutal truth: whatever you exile to the shadow doesn't disappear. It grows stronger in the dark. It starts running your life from behind the curtain. This is why people who pride themselves on being good often have the most chaotic secret lives. This is why those who judge others most harshly for sexual expression are often wrestling with their own unacknowledged desires. The shadow always finds a way out, through compulsion, projection, or sudden eruptions that seem to come from nowhere. Jung believed that much of what we call sexual dysfunction is actually shadow material demanding integration. The person who can't maintain interest in a committed relationship may be disowning their own need for freedom and wildness, projecting it onto unavailable partners. The person paralyzed by shame around desire may be refusing to acknowledge their own power, their capacity to want and be wanted. The person addicted to novelty may be fleeing from depth, from the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. I've seen this pattern in my own life, the way certain attractions felt forbidden, not because they were wrong, but because they revealed something about myself I wasn't ready to own. The way judgment of others' sexual choices was always a mirror, showing me what I was afraid to explore in myself. The way my most compulsive behaviors were always linked to desires I refused to consciously acknowledge, so they leaked out sideways, controlling me precisely because I wouldn't face them. Jung's approach to the shadow isn't moral condemnation or permissive indulgence. It's radical honesty. It's the willingness to look at your actual desires, not what you think you should want, but what you actually want, and ask what they're telling you about your unlived life, your disowned qualities, your path to wholeness. Sometimes a sexual attraction is revealing a quality you need to develop in yourself. That mysterious, powerful person you're drawn to. Maybe you need to cultivate your own mystery and power instead of seeking it externally. That nurturing, warm presence that makes you feel safe. Maybe you need to learn to nurture yourself. Jung called this withdrawing projections, recognizing that what you see in others is often a mirror of what's trying to emerge within you. Other times, shadow desires are compensatory, the psyche's attempt to balance a one-sided conscious attitude. The person whose life is all control and responsibility may find themselves drawn to scenarios of surrender. The person whose identity is built on being nice may be fascinated by aggressive, dominant archetypes. The psyche seeks equilibrium, and the shadow contains precisely the qualities the ego has overcompensated against. The danger, Jung warned, is remaining unconscious of these dynamics. Then you become their puppet, compulsively acting out patterns you don't understand, repeating the same relationship disasters, feeling driven by forces you can't name. You're being lived by your sexuality rather than consciously living it. The path of integration requires something uncommon, the courage to sit with your actual desires without immediately acting on them or judging them. To ask, what is this attraction showing me about myself? What quality am I projecting onto this person? What aspect of my psyche is trying to be born? Jung's most profound insight about sexuality might be this. The person you're looking for is already inside you. Every external search for the perfect partner, every projection of ideal love onto another human being, is actually a search for your own inner opposite. The contrasexual archetype Jung called the Anima in men and the Animus in women. This isn't metaphorical poetry. Jung was describing a psychological structure he observed again and again in dreams, fantasies, and the pattern of falling in love. The anima is a man's unconscious feminine side, his capacity for feeling, intuition, receptivity, emotional depth, connection to the irrational and the mysterious. The animus is a woman's unconscious masculine side, her capacity for assertion, logic, independence, spiritual conviction, penetrating insight. Most people, Jung observed, never consciously encounter these inner figures. Instead, they project them onto external partners. A man falls in love with a woman who carries his anima projection. She seems mysterious, feelingful, connected to life in ways he's forgotten. A woman falls in love with a man who carries her animus projection. He seems strong, clear, capable of the assertion and independence she's disowned in herself. And the falling in love is real. It feels like magic, because, in a sense, it is. You're meeting a part of yourself you've been separated from, reflected back through another person's presence. This is why new love feels like coming home and discovering a foreign country simultaneously. You're encountering your own wholeness, projected outward. But here's the problem Jung identified. Projection can't be maintained forever. The real human being eventually emerges from behind the projection screen, with their own limitations, neuroses, and humanity. And suddenly, the magic collapses. The person you idealized becomes disappointing, even hateful. You feel betrayed, disillusioned, convinced they've changed, when actually they were never who you thought they were. You were in love with yourself, with your own unrealized potential, wearing another person's face. This is the pattern behind most relationship cycles. Intense attraction, magical merger, gradual disillusionment, bitter ending, and then the search begins again for someone new to carry the projection. Round and round, never realizing that the beloved you're seeking isn't out there but in here, waiting to be integrated. Jung's alternative path is challenging but liberating. Develop a conscious relationship with your anima or animus. For women, this means cultivating your inner masculine, not by becoming harsh or rejecting femininity, but by developing your capacity for independent thought, clear boundaries, spiritual authority, and creative assertion. It means no longer waiting for a man to give you permission, clarity, or strength, because you've developed these qualities in yourself. I can tell you from experience, this changes everything. When you stop expecting external partners to complete you, to provide the assertion you won't claim, the independence you're afraid to embody, the spiritual direction you refuse to seek, relationships become clearer. You can see actual people instead of projection screens. You can choose partners based on genuine compatibility rather than unconscious need. For men, Jung suggested the parallel work. Developing conscious relationship with the Anima means befriending your own capacity for feeling, for vulnerability, for the irrational dimensions of life that logos alone can't grasp. It means no longer requiring women to do your emotional labor, to be the sole carriers of feeling and connection in your life, because you've developed these capacities yourself. Jung described the integration of the Anima and Animus as an inner marriage, the hieros gamos, the sacred union that alchemists wrote about in symbols of king and queen, sun and moon, gold and silver. When this union happens within you, your external relationships transform. You stop needing others to complete you. You can meet them as whole meeting whole, rather than fragment seeking fragment. And here's what happens to sexual energy in this process. It becomes available. Instead of being locked in compulsive patterns of seeking completion through others, your libido becomes flexible, creative, powerful. You can direct it consciously, into relationships, yes, but also into creative work, spiritual practice, bringing new things into being in the world. Jung believed this was the ultimate goal of psychological development, individuation, becoming whole, achieving the inner marriage that makes you capable of real relationship with others because you're no longer desperately using them to fill the holes in yourself. So here's my question for you. Can you identify which qualities you've been projecting onto others? The strengths you admire but haven't owned, the capacities you seek externally but haven't developed internally. Drop a comment below. Let's explore this together. The spiritual art of sex isn't learned in bedrooms. It's learned in the sometimes painful, always transformative work of becoming whole. Now we arrive at the practical alchemy. How do you actually transform sexual energy from compulsive craving into creative power? Jung's answer draws on centuries of esoteric tradition, from tantric practices to Christian mysticism to the symbolic language of medieval alchemy. The key is conscious attention. Sexual energy, Jung observed, is simply life force in its most concentrated form. It's your vitality, your passion, your capacity to create. Whether you're creating a child, a work of art, a business, a spiritual practice, or a transformed version of yourself. The energy itself is neutral. What matters is your relationship to it. Most people relate to sexual energy in one of two dysfunctional ways. The first is repression, denying the energy, trying to kill it through shame, religious discipline, or sheer willpower. Jung warned that this approach always backfires. The repressed energy doesn't disappear. It goes underground, where it becomes toxic, driving compulsive behavior, depression, psychosomatic illness, or sudden eruptions that destroy the carefully controlled persona. The second dysfunctional approach is unconscious indulgence, constantly acting out every sexual impulse without reflection, using sex as escape or validation or power, remaining forever in the literal level, where the symbol can never be properly read. This approach hemorrhages energy. You're constantly leaking power through scattered, compulsive actions that leave you emptier rather than fuller. Jung's third way is transmutation through conscious holding. When desire arises, and it will arise, you're human. Instead of immediately repressing it or acting on it, you attend to it. You feel the energy in your body. You notice the images, fantasies, emotions that accompany it. You ask what this energy wants to create in your life beyond mere physical release. This is an active meditation, not passive indulgence. You're not wallowing in fantasy, you're studying the psyche's symbolic language. That intense attraction to someone unavailable. What quality do they represent that you need to develop? That recurring fantasy scenario. What psychological dynamic is it pointing toward? That restless craving, what creative work is trying to be born through you? Ancient tantric practitioners understood this. They worked with sexual energy, not by denying it, but by containing it, allowing it to build, and then consciously directing it toward spiritual realization. The energy that would normally dissipate in physical release was instead moved up through the energy centers of the body, transforming from raw appetite to refined awareness. Medieval alchemists used sexual symbolism constantly. The union of king and queen, the marriage of sun and moon, the conjunctio that produces the philosopher's stone. They weren't being coy about literal chemistry. They were describing psychological processes of integrating opposites within consciousness. The heat of the alchemical vessel is desire itself, contained and consciously tended until it transforms lead into gold. base instinct into spiritual realization. I've experienced this transformation personally. There were periods when I consciously chose not to immediately discharge sexual energy, not from repression or moralism, but as an experiment in conscious holding. What I discovered was that the energy, when contained and attended to, began to flow into creative work with startling intensity. Writing came easier. Ideas arrived fully formed. Projects I'd been procrastinating on suddenly felt urgent and possible. It wasn't magic. It was physics. Energy follows attention. When you stop leaking power through compulsive discharge, that power becomes available for conscious direction. You become generative in the deepest sense, capable of bringing new things into existence, of creating from overflow rather than craving from lack. Jung called this process sublimation, but he meant something different from Freud's version. For Freud, sublimation was a second-best option. You can't have sex, so you paint a painting instead. For Jung, it was alchemy, the transformation of energy from one state to another, not as substitution, but as evolution. The sexual energy doesn't disappear. It becomes the fuel for individuation, for creativity, for the work of becoming whole. The practice requires discernment. Jung wasn't advocating permanent celibacy or total abstinence. He was suggesting conscious choice rather than compulsive reaction. Sometimes sexual expression is the right channel for the energy. Sometimes creative work is the right channel. Sometimes spiritual practice. The key is developing the capacity to choose, rather than being driven by unconscious forces. This is what transcending lust actually means. Not eliminating desire, but becoming its master rather than its slave. Transforming from someone who is lived by their appetites into someone who consciously directs their life force toward wholeness, creativity, and the realization of their deepest potential. So where does this leave us? After exploring the shadow, after beginning the work of integrating the anima or animus, after learning to consciously hold and transmute sexual energy, what changes? Jung's answer is both simple and profound. You become capable of genuine relationship, with yourself and with others. For the first time, the person who has done this inner work approaches sexuality from a completely different place. There's no desperate seeking, no compulsive craving, no using others as band-aids for inner emptiness. Instead, there's a groundedness, a capacity to be present with desire without being controlled by it, and a recognition that sexual connection, when it happens, is a gift shared between two whole people rather than a transaction between two fragments trying to complete each other. This is what Jung meant by the return to the sacred dimension of sexuality. Not sacred in some prudish, sanitized sense, but sacred as in whole. Sexuality reconnected to its psychological and spiritual roots, no longer split off from the rest of life and consciousness. When you've integrated your shadow, you're no longer projecting your disowned qualities onto partners, and then either idealizing or demonizing them. You can see people clearly, with both their gifts and their limitations, and choose consciously whether and how to engage. When you've developed relationship with your inner opposite, the anima or animus, you're no longer desperately seeking completion through external partners. You can engage in relationship from wholeness rather than need, from overflow rather than lack. This doesn't make relationships less passionate. It makes them more real, more sustainable, less likely to collapse when the initial projection wears off. When you've learned to consciously hold and transmute sexual energy, you have access to tremendous creative power. Your relationships become one channel for that power, but not the only one. You're generative across all dimensions of life, creating, building, contributing, becoming more fully yourself rather than scattering your energy in compulsive patterns that lead nowhere. I want to be clear, this isn't a destination you arrive at, and then you're done. It's a lifelong practice, a continuous process of becoming more conscious, more integrated, more whole. You'll still experience desire. You'll still face temptation toward old patterns. You'll still encounter situations that challenge your hard-won awareness. But the difference is profound. You have tools now. You have understanding. You know that desire is a messenger, not a master. You know that attractions reveal psychological material to be integrated, not just bodies to be pursued. You know that the energy moving through you is sacred, powerful, and yours to consciously direct. Jung believed that the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness, was the central task of human life, especially the second half of life. And sexuality, properly understood, is one of the primary paths of individuation. It's too powerful, too central to the psyche, too connected to our deepest creativity and spirituality, to be treated casually or repressed shamefully. The spiritual art of sex is ultimately about this, learning to relate to the most powerful force in your psyche with consciousness, respect, and creative intention. It's about moving from being driven by appetites you don't understand to consciously directing energies you've learned to befriend. It's about transforming from someone who uses sexuality to escape themselves into someone who uses it to become more fully themselves. And here's what I've discovered. When you do this work, your entire life transforms. Not just your sexual experiences, but your capacity for creativity, your depth of self-knowledge, your ability to be present with others, your sense of purpose and meaning. Because sexual energy is life energy, and learning to work with it consciously is learning to live consciously, fully, powerfully, creatively. Jung spent his life trying to restore to modern people what traditional cultures never lost: the understanding that sexuality is sacred, that desire is a doorway, that the body's hungers are the soul's language. Not sacred in some abstract, disembodied way, but sacred as in powerful, meaningful, connected to the deepest currents of psychological and spiritual life. This is the return Jung was pointing toward. Not back to some imagined innocent past, but forward to a new integration where sexuality is neither repressed nor indulged but understood, where the fire that can consume you becomes the light that guides you home to yourself. The journey begins the moment you stop running from desire or being controlled by it, and start asking what it's trying to teach you about who you're becoming. If Jung's vision resonates with you, if you're ready to stop being driven by compulsive patterns and start consciously directing your most powerful energies, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What's one pattern around desire or sexuality that you're ready to transform? What would change in your life if you could transmute that restless craving into creative power? And if this exploration has shifted something for you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who's ready to see sexuality not as a problem to manage, but as a path to wholeness. Subscribe to this channel for more depth psychology insights that challenge surface thinking and point toward real transformation. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Your shadow wants to be integrated. Your inner beloved is waiting to be met. Your creative fire is ready to be consciously tended. The question is, are you ready to do the work? This is the spiritual art Jung spent his lifetime illuminating. This is the path from lust to love, from compulsion to consciousness, from fragmentation to wholeness. The journey is yours to walk, and it begins now.